This is an analysis of Address on the Cuban Crisis, and it is a speech or a broadcast by John F. Kennedy from the 22nd October 1962, and it's from the White House, based on the Cuban crisis. And the American people is scared, and those are the values that John F. Kennedy appeals to. Therefore, he informs the people so they will stay calm, and he also stays calm because he has to, or else panic will break out, and it must not. He avoids using pathos as much as he uses ethos and logos, but he still uses it in a low degree. It says on page 2, line 29, in an area well known to have a special and historical relationship to the United States and the nations of the Western Hemisphere. And he mentioned this special place for the American people, and it awakens feelings in the American people. And as President of the United States, it is very important to show that you are informed and has studied the situation, and he shows that he has by using logos. It says on page 1, section 5, line 2, constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americans in flagrant and deliberate defiance of the Rio Pact of 1947, the traditions of this nation and hemisphere, the joint resolution of the 87th Congress, the Charter of the United Nations, and my own public warning to the Soviets on September 4 and 13th. And in this sentence he uses facts to inform the people and shows that he knows something, and therefore they should listen to him because what he says might be true. And at the same time he uses ethos, because it's way more appropriate than pathos is in this case. And it says at the very first line, "Good evening, my fellow citizens." And already here he uses ethos to create solidarity, because the American people is they attach importance to patriotism, and therefore ethos is an obvious appeal form to use. And the sentence continues, this government has maintained the closest civilians of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. And he states here that the US always keeps their promises, and by that he wins their trust. At the same time he brings out himself as the good man or the good leader. It's also very clear that whenever he talks about the US, the tone is very pleasant, and he talks positively about the country. But whenever he talks about the Soviet, the tone becomes negative, but in a formal way, because he has to keep the peace between the two countries. An example is on page 2, section 4, line 3. It says, our own strategic missiles have never been transferred to the territory of any other nation under a cloak of secrecy and deception and our history, unlike that of the Soviets since the end of the World War II. It's very clear that the tone changes, because it says strategic missiles. It means that the USA is clever, and it says never, and it underlines how good the US is. And then he says any other nation under a cloak of secrecy, and it puts shame on the Soviet. And he says our history, which appeals to how good USA has been through a lot of things. And here he also talks to Europe, because the US has helped Europe a lot. A couple of times he also quotes the Soviet government, and afterwards he says that their statements are false. So he puts the Soviet in a bad position, and the US in a good position. And the tone is also direct and a little threatening. This is on page 4, line 5. This nation is prepared to present its case against the Soviet threat to peace and our own proposal for a peaceful world at any time and in any forum, because they won't hesitate if the Soviet attacks. You can also see the alliteration in this sentence with the P. It says peace and peaceful. Those are words that are very notable because it brings out some very important words. Peaceful and peace are two wishes that Kennedy has for the Cuban people. And later he also says, free from foreign domination, free to choose their own leaders, free to select their own system, free to own their own land, free to speak and write. And it's from page 4, the second last part. And he wants the Cuban people to be free also, so he both wants peace and freedom for the Cuban people. There are also use of anaphora in this sentence, which is the word free, and it supports his wish that he really wants this freedom for them. And these two wishes is also one of his messages in a speech, not just for Cuba but for the entire world. The first message is that to the US it's not about being the strongest country, but about living in a world with peace and freedom. And then a second message could be that he knows that they're in a bad situation, and the worst thing USA can do is to not do anything and fear the Soviet. And even though it will be difficult and they would lose human beings, he would still do it to protect the rest of the world and the rest of the country. So the US is ready for a war, though he actually says that on page 3, line 2, we will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the cost of worldwide nuclear war, in which event the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. And it's a metaphor, and it means that he will not destroy the world unless he has to, because even if the US will win, it will not be a victory, and they will just be left with a lot of damage. So Kennedy informs his people through a TV broadcast about the situation in Cuba, and what seems to be a message to the nation also has a political meaning. He wishes to both inform the Americans but also to calm them, and he wants to show that he has the situation under control. Therefore he uses the appeal forms, and he also wants to show the Soviet that he is not afraid. He is ready for war if that's what's necessary. And at last he wants to make it clear to the world that the US does not wish for a war. He puts himself in a better light than the Soviet and strengthens his position. He also strengthened his position by using rhetorical devices. He shows that he can deliver an inspiring speech even when times are difficult.